Thank you, Pierre. Bonjour, je parle en français parce que mon anglais est très déficient. Puis, je parle quelques mots en anglais. Je suis très fier, très honoré de présider cette part de la session avec mes collègues et avec la présence de Stéphane Hessel, le grand indigné du monde. Je suis très fier de votre compagnie. Mon English is horribilis. And I am called to chair this session with my colleagues. Je préfère de commencer la session, de mode c'est important des experts. Je request la présence de John Dugard, please. Vous avez la parole.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, members of the jury. Other witnesses will deal or have dealt with the question of whether Israel's policies and practices in the occupied Palestinian territory, which I'm going to call the OPT, constitute the crime of apartheid within the meaning of the 1973 Convention on Apartheid. So I'm not going to deal with this matter. Instead, I'm going to consider the question whether in my personal experience of apartheid in South Africa and the situation in the OPT, there are substantial similarities between the two regimes. My testimony may confirm the fact that South Africa's policies and practices are repeated in the Palestinian territory and constitute the crime of apartheid, but that is not the scope of my testimony. My testimony is to share my own personal experiences and observations with you. I claim no expertise in respect of the treatment of Palestinians within Israel itself. I have some expertise which I will talk about in respect of the occupied Palestinian territory, and that is the only area I will talk about. I suppose as a sort of witness that claims to be an expert, I should at first establish my credentials, how I can claim to know something about the two regimes. First of all, apartheid. I spent most of my adult life in South Africa under apartheid. I opposed apartheid as an ordinary citizen, as an advocate, as a scholar, and as an NGO leader. I wrote prolifically on the subject of apartheid. I wrote in 1978 a book called Human Rights in the South African Legal Order, which I think can claim to be the most comprehensive study of the law of apartheid, in which I examined the injustices of apartheid and compared apartheid with international human rights standards. From 1978 to 1990, I was director of the Center for Applied Legal Studies, attached to the University of the Witwatersrand, a center which engaged in advocacy and litigation in the field of human rights. Through the Center for Applied Legal Studies, I engaged in legal challenges to the implementation of the racist discriminatory laws, to the security laws, which allow detention without trial and indirectly torture. I also challenged the establishment of the Bantustans in my writings, in the courts, and on public platforms. I had tremendous personal experience of what I regard as the three pillars of apartheid, which I will be talking about today: discrimination, repression, and territorial fragmentation. And when I talk about territorial fragmentation, that is simply a euphemism for the seizure of some other group's land. So if I was an expert on anything, it was on the law of apartheid. Turning now to Israel-Palestine, I started to visit that part of the world in the 1980s, mainly for academic conferences initially. In 1988, I participated in one in Jerusalem, East Jerusalem, during the first Intifada. In 1992, I was asked to review a legal aid bureau established by the Quakers in East Jerusalem. In 2001, I was appointed as chairman of a commission of inquiry to investigate human rights abuses during the second Intifada. That was a commission established by the Commission on Human Rights, which you will now probably know better by the name of the Human Rights Council. Shortly after I had completed that task, I was appointed as special rapporteur to the Commission on Human Rights to examine the human rights situation in the Palestinian territory, the occupied Palestinian territory, that is. And in this capacity, I visited the region twice a year for 7 years and reported to the Commission on Human Rights, later Human Rights Council, and to the third committee of the General Assembly. In 2003, I drew attention in my report to the de facto annexation of Palestinian territory by the construction of the wall. This led to the request for an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice, which found that the construction of the wall was unlawful, and in that opinion the court cited my report extensively. Finally, in 2008 to 2009, or rather 2009, I visited Gaza to chair a commission of inquiry established by the League of Arab States. That commission investigated the situation, or visited Gaza in February 2009, and our report made findings that were substantially similar to the later findings of the Goldstone Commission report. Let me just mention that I traveled extensively in the West Bank and in Gaza, and I used to stay in East Jerusalem, so I do know the territory extremely well. From my first visit, I was struck by the similarities between apartheid in South Africa and the practices in the Palestinian territory. But as Special Rapporteur, I deliberately refrained from drawing such comparisons until 2005, because I feared justifiably that if I drew attention to these comparisons, that Western states would not take my reports seriously. In fact, they never took my report seriously anyway. But after 2005, I decided that I could not in all good conscience refrain from making such comparisons, and so my reports thereafter did compare apartheid in South Africa with the policies and practices of Israel in the OPT. And obviously this did not endear me to many states. But now let me turn to the comparisons based upon my personal observations. At the outset, I think it's important to stress, as Max preceded, that the regimes of apartheid and occupation are very different. Apartheid South Africa was a state that practiced discrimination against its own people. It sought to fragment the country into white South Africa and black Bantustans in order to avoid having to extend the franchise to black South Africans. The security laws of the apartheid state were brutal and they were used to suppress political opposition. Israel, on the other hand, is an occupying power that controls a foreign territory, the Palestinian territory. And it controls the people of that territory under a regime recognized by international law, by international humanitarian law, called belligerent occupation. So there are important differences. But in practice, there's really little difference between the two systems. There are two regimes. I'm going to deal with them in some detail, but just let me say, before I go any further, that in many respects the apartheid regime was much more honest, because the laws of apartheid were openly legislated in Parliament and they were clear for all to see, whereas the laws governing Palestinians in the Palestinian territory are largely contained in obscure military decrees or inherited emergency regulations, which are virtually inaccessible. The crude signs of apartheid, of the kind that we see on the wall, are not to be found in the Palestinian territory. But on the other hand, the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, does enforce a system of segregation which they claim the Palestinians should know about without any racist signs. This is very clear, for instance, in respect of road apartheid, which we never had in South Africa. Palestinians simply know that if they use the inferior, if they do not use the inferior roads set aside for Palestinians, they will be arrested and their cars will be confiscated by the IDF. So there is separation, there are separate amenities, but these are not clearly marked as they were under the apartheid regime. And so that's why I say that in some respects the apartheid system was more open and honest. But now let me turn to the similarities. And this involves a comparison of what I've described as the three principal features of apartheid: discrimination, repression, and territorial fragmentation. To what extent are these features repeated in the Palestinian territory? And I'm going to be speaking largely about my personal observations. First of all, discrimination. Some of the laws and practices of Israel in the OPT are inherently discriminatory. Others are laws that discriminate between Palestinians and settlers in the Palestinian territory. First of all, the past laws, which were the most hurtful laws in South Africa, are they to be found in the Palestinian territory? The answer is yes. We have a system of checkpoints which require Palestinians to queue for hours and hours patiently with documents in order to move from one part of the Palestinian territory to another. These laws are both humiliating and discriminatory. They are humiliating in the sense that they treat Palestinians as subhumans, and they are discriminatory in the sense that they do not apply to settlers at all. Then there's the Group Areas Act, and it's very apposite that we think about the Group Areas Act in the District 6 Museum, because it was under the Group Areas Act that relocations took place in which District 6 was destroyed. Is there such a system in the Palestinian territory? There is. The Israelis practice a policy of house destructions. Houses are destroyed if Palestinians have not acquired a permit to build the house, and in practice permits are never granted to Palestinians whereas they are granted to Israelis and to settlers. So we have this policy of destruction of homes. I think Jeff Halper says that 2,600 homes have been destroyed in this process. And it's not only
26,000. 26,000.
26,000, it's 26,000. So it's a large number. And in addition, we find that some communities, particularly Bedouin encampments or communities, are often completely destroyed. So these measures are very similar to the Group Areas Act. Then another example, the wall which is built in Palestinian territory has a zone between the Green Line, the boundary border between Israel and Palestinian territory, between the Green Line and the wall. Israelis are free to move in that area. Palestinians are not permitted to enter without a permit. And then we have road apartheid, and so on and so forth. So we do have a large number of discriminatory measures that are applied in the Palestinian territory. Now let me turn to repression. Are the methods, brutal security measures that were employed by the South African security forces repeated by the IDF? The answer is yes. We have raids on homes, which are normally accompanied by brutality and the use of dogs. I've spoken to many people who have been subjected to raids of this kind. Torture, yes, torture is applied by the IDF, despite attempts by the Israeli Supreme Court to curb the severity of torture, but it is still implemented. Administrative detention, we did have administrative detention of political opponents of the government in South Africa, but not on the same scale as in Palestine. Political prisoners, there are more political prisoners in Israeli jails today, more Palestinian political prisoners, that is, than there were under apartheid in South Africa. We have something like 6,000 at least political prisoners. We did not have that number in South Africa. And then, of course, there is a destruction of houses for security measures. I saw the destruction of property, houses in Jenin in 2003 and in Rafah on a number of occasions. And I think one should also stress the fact that there are vigilantes called settlers, or settlers called vigilantes, or they don't like to go by that name, but they are tolerated by the IDF and to some extent approved. Fragmentation, I think it's clear that the Israeli authorities have seized land in the process of administering the territory. 500,000 settlers reside in the West Bank. Land has been seized for settlements. The construction of the wall has led to the seizure of Palestinian territory. And there are large military zones throughout the Palestinian territory which are closed to Palestinians. So I think one can safely conclude that the three principal features of apartheid, discrimination, repression, and territorial fragmentation, or the seizure of land, are repeated in the Palestinian territories. There are marked similarities, and I believe there are sufficient similarities between the two regimes to justify a full-scale investigation into the question of whether apartheid is to be found in the occupied Palestinian territory. In other words, whether Israel has committed the crime of apartheid. And of course, that is the task that the jury has before it. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur Dugard. Thank you very much, Mr. Dugard. Je peux formuler la réponse en français?
En anglais, s'il vous plaît.
En anglais, oui. Bien. Bien. C'était international language. I request, how central was the issue of national security and counter-terrorism law to apartheid in South Africa?
Well, one finds that security laws play an important role in Israel's administration of the Palestinian territory, as they did in the case of South Africa. But I think one must bear in mind that security is often a justification for repression. And I'd like to draw attention to the misuse or abuse of the term terrorism. Israel accuses Palestinians of terrorism, overlooking the fact that both the IDF and the settlers frequently engage in terrorist activities. And so it was in South Africa. So national security does play an important role, but I think one must bear in mind that it is simply, in many cases, overdone and just used as a repressive measure.
Oui, avant de poser ma question, comme je dois partir, je voudrais dire jusqu'à quel point le reste de l'Afrique et au-delà de ce qui s'est passé dans ce pays, en termes d'apartheid, nous avons vécu l'expérience de la colonisation et les luttes de décolonisation nous ont rapprochés de la Palestine. Et il y a une solidarité et une complicité historique entre la Palestine et l'Afrique de l'Ouest d'où je viens. Donc nous nous sentons d'autant plus concernés que nous avons le sentiment qu'un processus de recolonisation est en cours et tout ce que j'ai entendu ce matin se reproduit maintenant dans le cadre de l'ultralibéralisme où il y a dépossession, violence et le traitement des migrants noirs et rappelle considérablement ce qui se passe ici. L'apartheid tend à se mondialiser. C'est pour ça que la lutte pour la liberté de la Palestine et l'indépendance nous concerne. Cela étant dit, je suis très intéressé. J'ai suivi cet exposé avec beaucoup d'intérêt. Et j'aimerais bien que vous reveniez un peu sur cette expression quand vous dites que c'était un régime plus honnête ici. Si vous pouvez expliciter davantage cet aspect.
My French is not very good, but I think you're asking about the recolonization of, or whether Palestine practices colonization as well as apartheid. I do not have earphones.
Pouvez-vous répéter la question?
Ah, d'accord. Non, ça crache. C'était un commentaire, c'était pas la question. Hein, Oh, ok, il reprend.
Well, yeah. Yes, that's what I thought.
If I may,
But I think you were commenting on the question of colonization, and that's what I was going to respond to.
but also her comment was that South Africa, you made the comment that South Africa was more honest
Yes.
in its approach. And so her question pertained to the honesty of this maltreatment on both sides.
Yes, well, as I said, the South African apartheid regime was very open and honest. It argued that it was a system of separate development, that it was not discriminatory, that it was not repressive, and so its laws were there for everyone to see, which were justified by the government. But my complaint about the Israeli administration is that the laws are inaccessible frequently, and that you don't have amenities openly reserved for separate or for different groups. So in that respect, South Africa was more honest. But I know in your preface you did make mention of the problem of colonization, and I think one should see the whole settlement enterprise as a system of colonization.
Yes, very quickly. It's a question concerning the institutions of the law and the legal system and the extent to which apartheid is replicated within the system. In other words, access to courts and tribunals in the two different situations you've dealt with, South Africa and Israel.
I think the difference, and I know Emily Schaffer is going to be dealing with this later, is that in Israel, most of the trials occur in military courts, whereas in South Africa, political trials took place openly in the normal courts of the land. And so there was much more attention to due process, and political activists in South Africa were generally properly defended. We had a proper defense system, the Legal Aid Defense Fund, and later other bodies provided legal defense to political activists. And that does not apply to the same extent, as I'm aware, in the Palestinian territory, where trials are before military courts.
Une autre question? Merci. Thank you.